This map is a crime against humanity, also known as Germany. But before it was known as Germany, it was known as a bit of a big bully, and before it was known as a big bully, it was known as the Holy Roman Empire. While technically called the Holy Roman Empire, it was actually a collection of Holy Roman Empire wars, each being their own separate nation with their own separate government and interests, but all under some kind of organization. And as the history of this empire went on for about 1,000 years, the lack of true authority and decentralization of this region became more and more apparent. Yet one thing that these German states always adhered to was the need to protect each other, from outside threats that is. Being surrounded by the vast empires of France, Russia, Turkey, and Scandinavia, they needed to unite in order to stay alive. While the empire was technically a union of German states, it was in the same way that the UN is a union of all nations, an association of countries banded together to preserve stability and address common threats. This fractured yet secure state of the Holy Roman Empire provided the perfect breeding ground for new powers to rise. In the end, two countries reigned triumphant in Germany, Austria and Prussia. During Austria's rise to power, she faced a major problem. How are you supposed to create a great empire if your entire military high command has a collective IQ of 1, and that 1 IQ is stored within a dog whom you mistaked for a military strategist? Well, the Austrians had a little philosophy. If you can't beat them, marry them. But what if they're your sister? Marry them even harder, and so was the Austrian way, as it turned out to be a pretty effective method. By exploiting the complex dynastic system of medieval Europe, they managed to inherit a vast domain, upheld by only marriage, diplomacy, and some unsavory things. The ruling Habsburg family of Austria at its height was the most powerful European dynasty ever to exist. Habsburg kings were popping up in Belgium, Luxembourg, Iberia, Hungary, Bohemia, Italy, Germany, and the Balkans. And while the power of the Habsburgs would eventually decline, Austria retained most of her core strength, becoming a great power in their own right. But the Austrians were about to meet their greatest rival yet, as in the northmost reaches of Germany, a new house was on the rise. Now, Prussia had a little philosophy. If you disagree with something, send in the military. And in accordance with this philosophy, they were a little bit less into marrying your close relatives to create a grand empire, but what they were into was killing Austrians. And in order to do that, they would need a strong military. In 1965, Frederick William began the construction of a military controlled by the state rather than by the nobility, and Prussia would begin to invest more and more government resources into its soon-to-be formidable army. As the 1600s and 1700s went by, Prussia slowly carved out an empire in the small space it had between the Habsburgs, Poland, and Sweden, often playing these powers against each other to further her own interests. In the meantime, her various monarchs, all of whom happened to be named Frederick, slowly built up the Prussian army, waiting for the right moment in which they could steal the spotlight and claim their place among the great powers of Europe. That moment finally came under the reign of Frederick the Great, who was largely considered the best of the Fredericks. Conveniently, Austria had a female ruler inherit the throne at this time, which was a perfect excuse for war. So Frederick begins with a bang by declaring war on Austria to take the resource-rich region of Silesia and easily wins. And after that, he decides to switch it up a little by declaring war on Austria to take the resource-rich region of Silesia. He then realizes that he may have already done that, but won anyway, and instead of taking Silesia, he decided on taking Silesia. A good way to start off your reign, but for Frederick this was just the beginning. By this point, Prussia had developed a strong idea of military honor. Their armed forces received massive attention, and strict discipline was instilled into every single soldier. It was often described as, rather than a country with a military with a country. Yet all this was about to come crashing down as the year 1756 arrived. Here, Prussia found itself at war with the vast empires of Austria, France, and Russia, with only a faraway island nation as their ally. And after suffering a terrible defeat at the Battle of Künnersdorf against a combined Austro-Russian army, the capital in Berlin lay exposed and defenseless. Disaster seemed imminent, but despite basically nothing stopping them, the Austrians just did not attack. Whatever the cause for such a strategic miscalculation, the event almost certainly saved Prussia from an otherwise unavoidable collapse and was coined the Miracle of House Brandenburg. But despite this temporary setback, the Russian army was, within a few years, nearing the gates of Berlin once again, pressing on into Frederick's exposed eastern flank. but once again they were stopped. A Prussian sympathizer inherited the Russian throne and immediately made peace with Frederick, in the process throwing a years-long war effort, 138,000 Russian lives, and perhaps the last chance to stop this German beast down the drain. For this he was rightfully assassinated and his assassin pardoned, but the damage had already been done. Against all odds, Prussia came out of this war victorious, taking Silesia for the third time in 30 years and asserting themselves as the next great power in Central Europe. Only one thing stood between them and global domination, that aging empire to the south, Austria, and, the millions of people that they would have to kill in order to get there. So, in the end, who would win the struggle for Germany? A diplomatic empire or a triumphant military? Austria or Prussia? Well, you guessed it. The answer was France. Wait, what? France has a bit of a revolution. Okay, seems normal, but then part of that revolution thought that the revolution just wasn't revolutionary enough, so they start a revolution to replace the less revolutionary revolution with a more revolutionary revolution. But then the rest of the revolution says, whoa buddy, letting black people vote? That's a bit too revolutionary for us, and so they start a revolution to make the revolution a little bit less revolutionary. Then some people think, couldn't we go back to before all these revolutions? And so they start a revolution. Luckily, the last revolution manages to suppress it, but the guy they put in charge of suppressing it thinks, couldn't we go back to before all these revolutions? And so he starts a revolution, and he wins. The end result is that France has this midget in charge. The rest of Europe is a bit confused as to what just happened, so they kinda instinctively start shooting each other. Today, we know this as the Napoleonic Wars. Luckily for France, this man turned out to be one of the greatest military strategists of all time, and he solved the Great German Divide by just killing everyone. The Austrians at Austerlitz and the Prussians at Jena, with the rest of Germany following suit. So, 1,000 years after they founded it, the French dismantled the Holy Roman Empire by forcing the last emperor to abdicate his title along with any remaining powers over the German states. After that, Napoleon drove his unstoppable army into Spain, the Low Countries, Italy, the Baltics, and eventually towards the east. But his dominance over Europe would not last. After suffering through a terrible Russian winter, the French were forced on the defensive. 2 career-ending defeats later, and their emperor was banished to the faraway island of St. Helena, where he would end up spending the rest of his days. But not everything was back to normal. As he rampaged and conquered his way through the continent, Napoleon destroyed the empires that had dominated European geopolitics for centuries. This meant that when his empire finally succumbed to the few places he'd missed, there was basically nothing left of what once was. Nations that had been swept away and forgotten in the chaos had to be completely redrawn in one great Congress. The Congress of Vienna would be the most important meeting of the time. It established the dominant political philosophy of the coming century and also took time to assert the new great powers as well as their borders, interests, problems, assets, enemies, and allies, in the process predetermining the winners and losers of this new map. But you might notice something about the borders that they drew. There's no Poland. So who is the rest of Europe supposed to brutally torture for emotional support now? Wars on the continent had become too much of a safety hazard, so they needed a safe and secure arena on which to take out their frustrations. And they found that arena in new frontiers. Asia, China, Africa. When 2 nations provoked each other into a warlike stance, rather than fight a costly and ultimately pointless war on the mainland, they decided to fight it out in their colonial territories. Germany, however, was excluded from the possibility of a large colonial empire due to its somewhat landlocked position. Whilst they did manage to sneak in a few dominions here and there, they were mostly shoved out of the way by those who had already established themselves in the region. So without a Poland to murder or African countries to pillage, what are the Germans to do? Well, there's only one option, really. Go insane and start killing each other. Following the demise of Napoleon, Europe saw a radical new century with radical new ideas usher itself in. 2 of the most important movements that gained traction during this time were liberalism and nationalism, both of which would play a pivotal role in Germany's unification. The rise of nationalism gave the Germans a sense of unity and made them wonder why they remained so separated when they shared so much in common. By this point, the question wasn't if or why Germany should be united, but how this process would happen and who would lead it. Liberal movements made attempts at diplomatic unity. However, the most powerful German states, Austria and Prussia, were both conservative absolute monarchies, making their attempts basically pointless. War was to be the definite solution. Prussia got to work almost immediately under the influence of Otto von Bismarck, who was also called the Iron Chancellor. He began expanding their army and industry, as well as founding a German economic union that excluded Austria. After an easy war with Denmark to seize the region of Schleswig-Holstein, he turned his attention south towards that pesky Austro-Prussian divide that prevented total unification. With the help of some talented commanders, Prussia achieved a stunning victory in the following war, causing German states to abandon Vienna and flock to Berlin. As for Austria, her history is mostly downhill from here. Royal marriages tend to not work quite as well in the modern era, so they were deprived of their special ability. After retreating from German politics, she would proceed to retreat from her own politics as a large Hungarian population managed to cut out a sizable portion of the empire for themselves. They were now officially known as Austria-Hungary. But by now, I think a more fitting name would have been Austria, Bohemia, Slovakia, Romania, Serbia, Croatia, Poland, Italia, Slovenia, Bosnia, and many other cultures and ethnicities all stored into one nation because an Austrian married a Hungarian a couple centuries ago. Oh god, why does this nation exist in the modern era? Please kill it, please kill it, please kill it, please kill it. Hungary. After failing to come to Russia's aid in the Crimean War, she lost her last major ally on the continent, furthering her isolation from European geopolitics. Without a doubt, this was a great victory for Prussia, as she was able to bring together the rest of North Germany, but most of the south still remained divided and fractured among several independent German states. Outright conquering these places would harm the idea of national unity and antagonize locals, so the Prussians needed to go against every urge in their body and find a diplomatic solution. They needed something more than just unification for the sake of unification. They needed a rallying cause that all Germans could get behind. And what did Germans like to do more than kill France? With one swift move, all of Germany stood united against the French Republic Empire in the Franco-Prussian War. This was a quick, decisive, and devastating victory for Prussia, the last in a long string. The end result was a Germany united and a France humiliated. By this point, Prussia possessed the proudest nation in Europe, with the proudest military in Europe and the proudest scientists in Europe. But since at this point, everything was Europe, they were the strongest nation in the world. And honestly, who could beat that? It wasn't going to be anyone on their own, that's for sure. Well, the Serbian guy seems to think he has a shot. And that he does. The story is quite well known. A Serbian shoots an Austrian and the rest of Europe says, hey, that looks pretty fun, let's try shooting each other. And now we have World War I. This war pit Germany and her band of merry men up against the vast colonial empires of France, Russia, Britain, as well as essentially the entire world. And possessing only very incompetent allies, Germany was basically on its own. But it'll all be fine, Reich? After all, the German army was the finest military in Europe, certainly better than that pile of toothpicks and human feces that Russia called its military stockpile, and they had beaten France so heavily in 1870, why wouldn't the same occur here, especially considering the German population was almost twice that of France? On top of that, Germany was one of the most developed places in the world. One benefit of that fractured state which they were in for most of their history was that each city had a king. And each king was diverting the entirety of his time and effort to the bettering of his city. Germany now possessed the combined effort of hundreds of kings over hundreds of decades, and the end result was a massive industry with which to sustain a massive war. The advanced German railway network also allowed for a quick mobilization on a massive scale. This meant that within a timely manner, Hans No. 123 could be transferred to the fields of France, Hans No. 6845 to the fronts against Russia, and Hans No. 18987 to the desperate defense of Berlin, because that's how quickly this front line collapsed. Now, the chances are that you are not currently wearing a Prussian helmet and you are not currently in a military parade dedicated to celebrating the glory of our Kaiser's new mustache, so you probably know that despite everything I said, Germany loses this war. And there's a couple key reasons as to why they failed. First of all was their war plans. In the Franco-Prussian War, Germany exploited the delayed French mobilization in order to gain a decisive advantage before any French armies even showed up to stop them. Now, in this war, the same couldn't happen because France had already prepared by constructing an advanced fortification line along their German border. Russia, however, was not prepared, and they would have to traverse a vast area without any good transportation methods before they could even get to the front line. This gave Germany a window of opportunity in which they would only have to put up with France's army. Their plan, codenamed the Schlieffen Plan, was to quickly knock France out of the war before Russia could come to their aid, thus securing victory in the West before they even had to worry about the East. But what about those pesky fortifications that France had built along the border? Well, Germany would completely bypass them by going through Belgium and taking a different route into France. So essentially they would invade Belgium and crush the tiny Belgian army before France could react, turn south, overwhelm French resistance, capture Paris, and then we all get to drink beer under the Eiffel Tower. And this quick victory in the West was completely possible because the French army was a large, disorganized, and outdated pile of garbage. But that's the thing. It was a large, disorganized, and outdated pile of garbage, and the Germans had severely underestimated it. So here we get to why the plan failed. First of all, France put up much more resistance than anticipated. The first stages of the plan went well as they steamrolled through Belgium and northern France, but when they got to Paris they were stopped by desperate French defenders. In addition, Belgium wasn't much expecting to be dragged into a German-French war, and the Germans may have committed some atrocities along the way. This sudden act of aggression wasn't really appreciated in the international community, and it was appreciated even less in the United Kingdom, who joined the war against Germany. The nail in the coffin for the German plan was the fact that Russia mobilized much quicker than anticipated, launching an invasion just 1 month after the war started. So in the end, the Schlieffen Plan only put Germany in the exact position it wanted to avoid, fighting a long, two-front war of attrition against multiple enemies. With the first attempt at a quick victory having failed, Germany didn't really have a backup plan and soon realized how woefully unprepared they were for a long war. The usage of trench warfare on the Western Front would end up removing most strategy from the equation. Soon, the need for strategy became overshadowed by the need for resources: iron, coal, food. At least here Germany might be okay. After all, the German industry now turned war machine was monstrous, and any resources they lacked they could just import. Well, not exactly. The German industry was large, but suffered from poor management and ultimately would not be enough to sustain the war Germany was fighting. So imports were the only way, but these were also difficult to find. Germany was at war with most of their land neighbors, and you could probably imagine nations would stop trading with each other when they're killing millions of their own people in war. As for the neighbors they weren't at war with, well, they didn't really have much to offer. So sea lanes were the Kaiser's only option. But here, Britain proved to be their biggest enemy. The Royal Navy instituted a strict blockade of imports coming to Germany, severely limiting access to food. But the Germans had their own navy. Why don't they use that to stop the blockade? Insert the naval front of World War I. It was fairly uneventful, so I should be able to summarize it in a few sentences. Britain blockades Germany. Germany tries to make them not do that. Germany gets scared and retreats. Britain gets scared and retreats. Britain blockades Germany. This may not seem too significant, but it actually played a major role in German defeat as it slowly sapped their resources and put Germany in a race against time. Britain and France, however, had vast colonial empires, giving them access to all the resources they could ever need, as well as uninterrupted shipping lanes. Yet, despite all these setbacks, Germany still appeared to be winning. By 1918, they had achieved total victory in the East, sending the defeated Russian Empire into a disastrous, years-long civil war. And French defeat didn't seem too far away either. France had become tired of the war, and their army was close to mutiny. Perhaps some 500,000 reinforcements coming in from the East was exactly what the Germans needed to just tip the scales in their favor. Well, except... The entry of the United States into the First World War essentially doomed the Germans. But why was the US even interested in sacrificing thousands of men in a faraway European war? Well, Germany had done a lot to provoke them. In an attempt to utilize its submarine fleet and starve the UK into submission, the Kaiser decided to implement unrestricted submarine warfare, allowing them to sink all transport ships going into the United Kingdom, and some of the ships they sunk were American ships, causing some difficult diplomatic discussions. Luckily for Germany, this alone wasn't enough to provoke a military response until they made yet another terrible decision. In an attempt to keep the US distracted, they sent the Zimmerman telegram to Mexico in which they promised them a large amount of land in the western United States if they started a war. The first problem with this was that Mexico was currently in a civil war itself and in no position to start a conflict with a foreign power. But perhaps more important was the fact that Britain intercepted this message and showed it to the Americans, causing outrage and eventually a US declaration of war. It took the United States about a year to mobilize all their important war materials, but once they were off, they were really off. In the meantime, Germany tried desperately to break through the Allied lines, only achieving minimal successes. By the time fresh, unscarred, and excited American troops arrived, the Germans had expended much of their fighting capability. All across the front, the German line was collapsing as Entente forces finally made it into Germany itself. One internal revolution and abdication later, and Germany made peace with the Allies. The resulting Treaty of Versailles was one of the most infamous and hated papers of its time, and it did nothing but ensure that the war to end all wars would instead become the war that caused all wars. Among other things, it forced Germany to accept full responsibility for a war it didn't start, made them give up large amounts of territory and disarm, as well as pay crushing reparations that would not and could not be paid. But this was a well-earned victory for France and Britain. They obviously weren't going to care about the implications it had on the losers. Whilst the treaty was undoubtedly harsh, just imagine if a massive lion came into your house, uninvited, explained that it had to kill your neighbor in order to get there, then it proceeded to kill half your family, and you had to fight it off using tanks and chlorine gas. You would probably be upset too. Not to say that Germany was the only one who got punished. Bulgaria lost its access to the Aegean Sea and paid heavy reparations to Serbia. The Ottomans had most of their land colonized, being reduced to a small rump state in Anatolia. However, large swaths of this treaty were undone by Ataturk and his Turkish Republic. Austria was essentially torn apart into several weak independent nations, and this region as a whole only became more fractured from here on. But in none of these nations was there such a desire for revenge like there was in Germany. They were still a powerhouse, but just not allowed to recognize it. The economic and political instability of the current government, coupled with a yearning for past glory, led to the rise of political extremism as the far right and far left would battle it out for the sympathy of the German people. But in the end, that's why Germany lost World War I. A flawed plan that caused a lack of preparedness for war, a British blockade that sapped her stockpile dry, and a couple terrible decisions that led to war with an overseas superpower. Nah, it was actually just the Jews, said this guy and his band of drunkards, and oh. Now he's dictator of Germany. Now Germany's at war with everyone again. Except Italy, we're allied with them. Well, yeah. We're allied with Italy. So we're basically at war with everyone. Welcome, my unborn fetus conscript, to World War II. The 1930s in Germany saw the rise of a man, whom I will refer to as Schmittler, and his party, whom I will refer to as the Nasties. Schmittler promised to tired and desperate German people that he would return their past glory and fix the economic stagnation that plagued the current democracy. And by exploiting a pre-existing distrust of a certain minority, he managed to elevate himself to near dictatorial power. From day one, he would begin undoing the restrictions placed on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles, one step at a time. The Nasties gambled what was left of the German economy on a massive rearmament, intent on starting a war that allowed them to plunder money from other countries and use those stolen resources to restart their industry. Britain and France were a bit confused as to what to do about this tiny man shouting about his tiny army, so they kinda just ignored him as he slowly got prepared for another world war. Eventually, the Nasties got a chance to use their shiny new military. On Poland, of course. In September 1939, Germany declared war on Poland, and with the help of Soviet forces, easily rolled over the Polish military. There was no turning back from here. Now they had to turn west and face the same enemies who had defeated their imperial self just a few years ago. Once again, France had prepared advanced fortifications on their border with Germany, and once again the Germans bypassed it by going through Belgium. But this time, the French could not stop them as a fast-moving armored spearhead trapped the Allied defenders in the Low Countries. With that, there wasn't much stopping Germany from rolling into Paris and seizing the resources she desperately needed in World War I. The time was ripe for an invasion of the United Kingdom to finish the war off, but that never came. This time, the Wehrmacht was stopped by the greatest enemy of the German people: water. And burgers. But while Britannia definitely still ruled the waves, Germany was unstoppable on land. The hostile and rowdy Balkan region was totally pacified by a short campaign, and after this easy success, Germany turned to the last thing left to invade: the Soviet Union. It was here that the German army saw its most unbelievable successes ever. 420,000 Russians surrendered at Minsk, 700,000 at Kiev, 750,000 at Smolensk, and 600,000 at Bryansk. So far, it had been a welcome change in pace from the slog that was World War I, but that was about to change. After mobilizing essentially everything in their country, the Red Army managed to achieve the first major nasty defeat in Europe. It's all downhill from here, or uphill, depending on how you look at it. The Nasties had yet another chance to inflict a decisive blow on the USSR at Stalingrad, but once again they failed due to the overstretched state of the German army. Similarly to the Roman Empire, Nasty Germany was just too big. The Red Army began the push to retake the occupied sections of their country, and a failed German offensive at Kursk only sped up their progress, but that paled in comparison to what else they were about to face in 1943. They soon met an unstoppable force that had torn apart countless empires before them: Italian military incompetence. With the Allies having utilized such a powerful force, the Wehrmacht just didn't compare. Back in the German war room, they were running out of ideas, and when they weren't running out of ideas, they were running out of resources. And so, as quickly as it had been conquered by the Germans, Europe was unconquered by the Allies, whose liberation trains steamrolled through Nazi-occupied Europe. Minsk was liberated in June 1944, Paris in August 1944, Warsaw and the Polish concentration camps in January 1945, Frankfurt in March 1945, and finally... Berlin in May 1945. The myth of Aryan supremacy had been shattered, the once unstoppable nasty army now reduced to a few desperate fanatics with pointy sticks. Now, with a sizable portion of the population having been decimated and nobody really to blame except themselves, Germany entered a new dark era. They were now trapped at the epicenter of a new global conflict which they really wanted no part of. Both the United States and the Soviet Union undertook a campaign of deindustrializing Germany in an attempt to make sure that this already dead nation was too dead to start another world war. Perhaps a well-deserved punishment considering the atrocities they had committed in Poland, but a pretty bad one nonetheless. Yet things began to turn up. West Germany experienced an economic boom around the 1960s, something that the East was unable to parallel, upsetting the balance of power. Whilst the West received generous economic support from the USA, the East was extensively plundered by the USSR. The rise of more conservative leaders in Britain, America, and the Middle East, as well as the overall stagnation of the late Soviet economy, left Russia and her puppets in Eastern Europe in a bit of a collapsy mood. In November 1991, the Soviet wall around Berlin fell to a crowd of tired Germans, and 1 year later the two halves united once again. A triumphant moment for the newly unified Germany, but the rest of Europe looked on with worried expressions. That same superpower that had brought the continent to its knees twice in just the past century was back. This new nation had something to prove. As it turns out, decades of peace would end up showing that Germany was no longer the big baddie that it used to be, and there's a couple good reasons for that. One is that being a big baddie is just impractical nowadays. With the USA and Russia having nuclear arsenals numbering in the thousands, a global war on the same scale that the nasties pursued is impossible, if humanity wants to survive. But even if Germany did want to start a world war, the reality is that the current state of their army is quite pitiful, with the majority of it being deployed in international defense forces anyway. And on top of that, why would they go to war? The German people today just don't have that same bitterness that allowed the nasties to rise to power. Instead, they found a new weapon to achieve their geopolitical goals: diplomacy. Once again, Germany managed to subjugate France, this time not using a heavy armored spearhead rampaging its way towards Paris, but by instead establishing a strong mutual bond and pursuing further economic cooperation to end the history of these two nations on a high note. One byproduct of these two countries' reconciliation also turned out to be extremely beneficial for Germany: the European Union. Now, keep in mind, I'm a dumb American, so you probably shouldn't entirely trust my opinion on European politics, but here's my best attempt at summarizing the organization. The countries of Western Europe founded the EU in an attempt to tear down the petty barriers that they created and prevent the continent from taking the same nationalistic path that plunged it into total chaos before. As such, they have pursued an extensive campaign to tie the economic and political structures of Europe into one single identity. Member states are given access to the vast amount of mineral and human resources that can be found across the continent, allowing for steady economic development all across the board. And in this free market, Germany dominates as the continent's breadwinner, often having to care for those less prosperous countries. With the economies of Europe tied so closely together, what need is there for war? Of course, the benefits of the EU don't come without downsides. Access to this wealthy market also means having to sacrifice large amounts of national sovereignty and border control, which were the two primary reasons for the UK deciding to leave the organization. This also explains why the European nations who aren't currently in the Union are those who still have something to fight over. And at the end of the day, some things are just inevitable. Germany is still unable to make the United Kingdom surrender, and the invasion of Russia has largely failed. Yet it's not like Germany needs these nations to support herself. Today, Germans enjoy one of the highest standards of living found on the planet, fueled by their productive, tax-paying population. If you look at a map of Europe by each country's largest trading partner, it looks like one of Schmittler's wildest dreams, with a few minor discrepancies. The relative lack of economically developed countries in southern Europe leaves a large population of skilled workers living in unskilled countries. Why would these Turks, Greeks, Italians, Spaniards, and Portuguese Porchafloppians? Okay, sure, Porchafloppians stay in their home country when there is much better opportunity just up north, in Germany. Everyone wants a piece of the German industrial pie, whether it be imported goods, job opportunity, or a desire to not have your house destroyed by a fighter jet it produced. And even if Germany somehow screws up what they have like they did a century ago, if there's one thing history has taught us, it would be this. No matter how many times you defeat Germany, they will always come back with a moderately different flag and a moderately different name.